Hello and welcome. Today we're going to talk about the Fair Labor Standards Act and how this law affects you in the workplace. The Fair Labor Standards Act is a federal law that governs things like child labor laws, minimum wage, and overtime standards. Now, when you hear the words child labor, you might get a mental image of children in sweatshops toiling away, but child labor laws apply to any worker under the age of 18. So as minors, you are all subject to the rules regarding child labor. That means that there are rules about the times of day that you can work, the number of hours per week that you can work, and the type of work that you can do. It's important for you to know all of these rules so that you can make sure you and your employer are following them. So, what kind of workers are covered by the FLSA? Virtually any paid employee-employer relationship is going to be covered by the FLSA standards. This includes employees of any business that is engaged in interstate commerce, produces goods for interstate commerce, or handles, sells, or otherwise works on goods or materials that have been moved or produced for interstate commerce. This broad definition covers most of the employers that you, as minors seeking your first job, will probably encounter. Some examples of employers that are covered under FLSA are fast food restaurants, sit-down restaurants like Perkins, grocery stores, retail stores like Target, and just about any other company you can think of. There are some exceptions where the FLSA standards apply differently or don't apply at all. For example, small employers have a different set of standards for the wages they pay and when they are required to pay overtime, which we'll talk about later. A business is considered a small employer when they do less than $500,000 in business per year. That might sound like a huge amount of money, but it really isn't much when we're talking about how much a business takes in over the course of a year. Even many small, family-owned businesses do more than $500,000 a year, so small employers are few and far between. Another exception to the FLSA standards includes students who are in a cooperative career and technical education training program. These students are not subject to the same rules as a paid employee. The final exception we'll talk about here is volunteer work for charities and nonprofit organizations. Obviously, if you've agreed to do volunteer work, you're not engaged in an employment relationship, so you're not subject to the FLSA standards. Let's talk a bit about what the FLSA standards are for minors who are employed. We'll start with the legal restrictions for 16 and 17-year-olds. First, it's important for you to know that you're only allowed to work at certain times of day. Namely, you may not work before 5 a.m. or after 11 p.m. Those hours can be extended to 4:30 a.m. and 11:30 p.m. with written permission from your parent or guardian. You're also restricted to no more than 40 hours per week of work. The reasoning behind these rules has mostly to do with the fact that you're all still in school, and school should be your first priority. Secondly, for the most part, you are never allowed to drive as part of your job. There are a few exceptions for 17-year-olds, but these exceptions are highly restrictive, and driving can only be an occasional or incidental part of the job. So it's highly unlikely that as a part of your job you'll be asked to drive at any point. The other major restrictions for minors in a place of employment has to do with hazardous occupations. For your safety, you're not allowed to perform any work that is considered hazardous by the Department of Labor. Hazardous occupations include things like working with explosives or radioactive substances, operating power-driven machinery, any sort of mining, logging, slaughtering, or meatpacking, roofing, demolition, and excavation. There are some very specific exemptions to the hazardous occupation rule, which is something you should discuss with your work coordinator if you're interested in a field that's considered to be hazardous. And now on to the legal restrictions for 14 and 15-year-olds. All of the restrictions that we've just discussed apply to you as well, and there are even more stringent rules regarding your employment. First, the hours you are allowed to work are very restricted. You may not work more than 3 hours a day on a school day, and no more than 18 hours a week during the school year. What's more, you are also not allowed to work before 7 a.m. nor after 7 p.m., and you are not allowed to work during school hours unless you're enrolled in a specific program called Work Experience and Career Exploration Programs, or WESEP. Now, during the summer, from June through Labor Day, you may work as late as 9 p.m. On non-school days, you may work as many as 8 hours, and you may work up to 40 hours in a non-school week. So as you can see, the hours for 14 and 15-year-olds are very restrictive, particularly during the school year. With regard to hazardous occupations, all of the rules we discussed in the last slide apply to 14 and 15-year-olds as well, and there are no exceptions for these ages. In addition, there are some other work activities that are prohibited. These include manufacturing, transportation jobs, cooking, warehouse and workroom work, public messenger services, and work on construction sites unless you're working in the office. Now let's stop here for a little comprehension check. I'd like each of you to answer the following questions for your specific situation. What times of day are you not allowed to work, assuming that we're talking about working during the school year? And how many hours per week are you allowed to work? Next, we're going to talk about the minimum wage. The Department of Labor sets the federal minimum wage under the FLSA. Currently, the federal minimum wage is $7.25 an hour. However, states are free to set their own minimum wages as well. You may have heard about recent increases in the minimum wage in places like Seattle and San Francisco. Minnesota also has its own standard for minimum wage, which is currently set at $8 per hour. This is another case where there are exceptions for small businesses, like we've discussed before, but most employers are going to be party to the state minimum wage. However, there is a catch. Minnesota also has rules about youth wages, which can be paid to anyone under the age of 18, and training wages, which can be paid to anyone under the age of 20 during the first 90 days of their employment. So for many of you, you may not start out right away making that $8 an hour. This table shows you the minimum wage for each category we've just discussed: large employers, small employers, youth wages, and training wages. What you'll also see on this table is the schedule of increases to the minimum wage that are going to be taking place in August of 2015 and August of 2016. Last year, the state legislature passed a bill to raise the minimum wage in Minnesota to $9.50 an hour by the year 2016. Let's stop again here for a comprehension check. Each of you are currently studying some type of job that you're interested in applying for. Given your age and the job that you're studying, please calculate the wage you should expect to make when you begin that job. Some things to consider when calculating your wage should be whether you're planning to work for a large or small employer, your age, and whether you expect to earn a training wage during your first 90 days. Feel free to use the table on the previous slide as your reference. Now let's talk a bit about overtime. For the vast majority of employers, overtime is any time worked over 40 hours in a single work week. There are exceptions for very small businesses in which overtime begins at 48 hours a week. However, that is highly unlikely to apply to most of your situations. For any time that you work over 40 hours, your employer is required to pay you time and a half, or 1.5 times your normal hourly wage. So let's stop one more time for a comprehension check. Under the Federal Labor Standards Act, as a minor, are you eligible to work overtime? Secondly, a question for your discussion. What should you do if your employer has scheduled you to work more than 40 hours in a single week? Please take a moment to discuss these two questions. Okay, we have now covered all of the critical pieces of the Federal Labor Standards Act. You should be ready to go out into the working world prepared with information about your rights, the rules that apply to your situation as a minor, and the wage that you can expect to make as you begin your working life. Thanks for watching.